I had heard the rumors about Fort Hill Cemetery for years. People talked about strange noises, shadowy figures that disappeared the moment you looked at them, and voices calling out in the dead of night. But I never put stock in ghost stories until one fateful evening. It was late fall, and the air had that sharp bite to it that hinted at winter's arrival. I had been walking through the nearby park, and as the sky turned dark, I found myself standing at the entrance of Fort Hill Cemetery. I'd passed it countless times before, but something that night felt different. The cemetery, tucked away in its quiet corner, seemed to beckon me in. Something inside me urged me to explore, to finally see what all the rumors were about. I stepped through the rusty iron gates, my footsteps crunching on the dry leaves that carpeted the ground. The trees, stripped of their leaves, stood like skeletal sentinels against the night sky. It was peaceful at first, almost serene. But then the air grew colder. My breath became visible, drifting in front of my face in the freezing air. And then I heard it, a faint whisper so quiet at first. I thought it was the wind, but it was unmistakable. Jenna. I froze, my name. The voice was soft, yet it seemed to echo through the empty cemetery. I turned around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. But there was nothing. The place was deserted. I started to walk again, my mind trying to rationalize it. It was just my imagination. I was alone, and the cemetery was just a cemetery. But then the whispers came again, this time louder, more urgent. Jenna, come closer. I turned quickly, my heart racing. There was nothing but fog, thick and swirling around the gravestones. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The whispers were all around me now, coming from all directions, like an army of voices calling my name. I tried to move faster, but my feet felt like they were glued to the ground. My body was frozen, not from the cold, but from fear. I wanted to scream, but my voice was lost in the overwhelming chorus of whispers. And then I felt it, a cold hand, light but firm, press against my shoulder. I whipped around, heart hammering, but there was no one there, nothing. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I stumbled backward. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, as though the earth itself was alive, breathing, waiting. I ran. My feet pounded against the gravel paths, my heart hammering in my chest, but the whispers grew louder, closer, until it felt like they were right behind me. I could feel their cold breath on my neck, their hollow voices clawing at my sanity. Jenna, you can't leave. As I reached the gates, I saw a figure standing just beyond the fog, at the edge of the cemetery. A shadow, with pale, empty eyes, staring at me. Its mouth opened in a silent scream, and I felt a chill so deep that it cut through my bones. I didn't look back as I sprinted out of the cemetery, gasping for air. I didn't stop running until I was blocks away, safe in my apartment. But as I lay in bed that night, my heart still raced. And then I heard it again, the whispers, faint but clear, coming from somewhere far away. Jenna, come back. We need you. I bolted upright in bed, drenched in sweat. That night I locked every door and window in my apartment, but I couldn't escape the feeling that something was waiting for me to return. Fort Hill Cemetery had always intrigued me. It had this eerie, otherworldly quality that drew me in, despite the dark rumors surrounding it. People spoke of strange sightings, unexplained cold spots, and the fact that the cemetery was often too quiet for comfort, as though the dead refused to rest. I decided to go there one autumn evening, hoping to unravel the mystery for myself. I figured a quick walk around the gravestones would be harmless, a bit of adventure to spice up my usual routine. As I walked through the gates, the first thing I noticed was how silent it was. No birds, no wind, not even the rustling of leaves. It was as if the world had gone still. The air felt heavy. Each step I took seemed to echo unnaturally. I passed old gravestones, some cracked and weathered, some newer, but all seemed to bear the weight of age and loss. As I wandered deeper into the cemetery, I began to feel watched. The sensation was subtle at first, just a sense that someone or something was keeping its eyes on me. I kept walking, thinking it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I saw him, a figure, standing near an old mausoleum at the far end of the cemetery. He was tall, dressed in a long black coat, with a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face. He stood perfectly still, his posture unnervingly rigid, as if he was waiting for me. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he was just another person visiting a loved one, I thought. But something about him seemed wrong. He wasn't moving, not even a slight shift of his shoulders. It was almost as though he was frozen in time. Curiosity got the better of me, and I began walking toward him. But as I did, the air grew colder, heavier, and my heart started to race. It was as if the world was slowing down, the shadows around me deepening. I couldn't explain it, but the closer I got to him, the more I felt a sense of dread crawling up my spine. It was like the cemetery was holding its breath, waiting. When I reached the spot where the figure had been standing, he was gone. The place where he had stood was empty. His presence vanished without a trace. The silence was suffocating now, thick with a feeling I couldn't shake. Then I heard it, a voice low, raspy, almost like a growl whispered from behind me. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around, but there was no one. My pulse quickened as I scanned the area, but there was nothing, just empty graves and the cold, looming mausoleums. Then I felt something cold and unseen brush against the back of my neck. I jerked forward, heart hammering, and that's when I saw it. The figure was standing at the gate now, closer than before, his face still hidden beneath the brim of his hat. But his eyes were glowing faintly, a sickly, pale yellow. The air around him seemed to shimmer with an unnatural energy. I ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, my legs burning, my breath ragged in my chest. But no matter how fast I went, I felt his presence behind me, following me, inching closer. Every time I dared to glance over my shoulder, I saw him there, just a little farther behind, but always there. When I finally made it to the cemetery gates, I turned around to see him one last time. His figure stood there at the edge of the cemetery, staring at me with those haunting, glowing eyes. But as I turned to leave, I heard his voice once more, this time much clearer, much colder. The dead never forget. I ran faster, not stopping until I was home, my body shaking with terror. But as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there waiting, his eyes always on me. Fort Hill Cemetery had always been a place of mystery. It wasn't just its age or the peculiar gravestones. It was the eerie silence that blanketed the place, as if the dead themselves were waiting for something or someone. One night, feeling particularly daring, I decided to visit the cemetery after dark. I was curious about the stories I'd heard, whispers of an old gravekeeper who had vanished years ago, but whose presence lingered. Some said he was a ghost, bound to guard the cemetery, and others swore they saw him standing among the gravestones at night, his lantern casting a sickly glow. As I walked past the broken gate, the air felt thick, almost oppressive. The wind had died down, and the quiet was unsettling, so much so that the sound of my own footsteps seemed unnaturally loud. I wandered deeper into the cemetery, my heart racing, half in fear, half in excitement. But as I ventured further, I began to feel wrong, like something was shifting in the atmosphere, something watching me. The gravestones were old, covered in moss, the names barely legible. I had almost reached the far end when I saw it, the mausoleum, dark and ominous, sitting like a tombstone itself. I approached it cautiously, drawn by some inexplicable force, and as I pushed open the heavy iron door, I was hit by a musty, decaying smell. The room inside was cold, too cold for the mild evening outside. I stepped inside, my breath fogging in the air. And then I heard it, a slow, deliberate shuffle of feet. I turned quickly, but the space was empty. That's when I saw him, the gravekeeper. He was standing in the corner, his figure barely visible in the darkness, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His clothes were tattered, his hands trembling slightly as he held a lantern. I couldn't see his eyes, but I felt them on me, cold and knowing. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered, his voice hoarse and raspy. My pulse quickened, and I wanted to leave. I turned to the door, but it slammed shut on its own, trapping me inside. Panic rose within me. "You don't belong here," he said again, his voice a low growl. "The dead, they're waiting." I backed away slowly, my mind racing. But when I turned to look for a way out, I saw it, a figure emerging from the shadows, its face twisted in agony. Then another and another. Spirits, ghosts of the dead, surrounded me, their hollow eyes filled with sorrow and rage. The gravekeeper's voice grew louder. "They will never let you go." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The spirits closed in on me, their hands cold and grasping. I felt their icy fingers touch my skin, pulling me toward them. Just as they reached for me, I felt something cold press against my neck. I spun around, and the gravekeeper's face was inches from mine, his eyes empty, black holes that sucked me in. "You're already one of us," he whispered, his voice sending chills through my entire body. And then everything went black. When I woke, I was outside the cemetery, standing at the gates, breathing heavily. My heart pounded as I looked around. The night had passed and the sun was beginning to rise. But something was different. I could still hear the gravekeeper's voice in my head, and the faces of the spirits